So my clock is saying 11 o'clock Central. It's a pleasure to rejoin. What an amazing morning it's been. So just blown away and have learned so much and excited for this next final lecture. I'm going to welcome Dr. Paul Irwin, who's the Dean of the School of Public Health, to introduce the Kilgore Lectureship. Before doing that, I just briefly want to acknowledge Dr. Ken Sagg. So Ken Sagg was my predecessor as the core director. I was instrumental in working with leadership in the School of Public Health, including Irwin, in establishing the Meredith Kilgore Endowed Lectureship to honor our great friend and colleague and collaborator and director of the UAB Corps. So with that, Irwin, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your partnership, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Multiphase. As Dean of the School of Public Health, I'm honored to introduce our second Meredith Kilgore Endowed Lecture in Outcome Measurements. I also, as you, Dr. Multiphase, want to express my deep appreciation to Dr. Ken Sagg for initiating these efforts to establish the lectureship, to Dr. Paul Muntner for his support, and especially to Dr. Julie Locker for her grace and kindness in working with us to make this a reality. But that thanks goes to all of you who have contributed to the establishment of this endowed lectureship, and to you, Dr. Multiphase, for continuing to support and give great visibility to this lecture. Upon completing his PhD in California, Meredith was recruited back to the UAB School of Public Health as a faculty member in the Department of Healthcare Organization and Policy, where he taught how medical decision-making relates to quality of life and treatment options. He served as chair of the department from 2012 until his death in 2018. He also served as co-director of the COERE and the ARC T32 training program. Meredith Kilgore was an uncommon man of wide-ranging interest and gifts. He was not someone to be effortlessly forgotten. From mentoring aspiring researchers to speaking Japanese, providing insights into health economics, and deftly playing jazz piano, Meredith could be counted on for sharing intriguing life experiences and perspectives. Foremost professionally, he was adept at creating cross-campus and external collaborations with the goal of helping others live healthy, productive lives. The manner in which Meredith conducted his life is reflected in the words of Leonardo da Vinci. It had long since come to my attention that people of accomplishment rarely sat back and let things happen to them. They went out and happened to things. Meredith was an exceptional champion for the COERE and health services outcomes effectiveness research, not only in the School of Public Health, but also across UAB's campus. From mentoring students and early career faculty to creating cross-discipline collaborations, Dr. Kilgore embodied the mission of the COERE. We believe this endowed lectureship will not only continue Meredith's work to encourage collaborative research across schools and disciplines, but also grow outcomes research and philanthropic contributions in its support here at UAB. Thank you again, Dr. Multiphase, for your leadership and for allowing me to honor Dr. Meredith Kilgore. I'm very honored now to turn the virtual podium over for the introduction of our 2022 Meredith Kilgore Endowed Lecturer, Dr. Linda Collins. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Irwin. I'm delighted to introduce one of, if not the key progenitor of the multi-phase optimization strategy framework, Dr. Linda Collins. Dr. Collins is professor of global public health in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at New York University. She earned her BA in psychology at the University of Connecticut and her PhD in quantitative psychology at the University of Southern California. Collins's research interests are focused on the development, dissemination, and application of the multi-phase optimization strategy, a framework for the optimization of behavioral, biobehavioral, and social structural interventions. Dr. Collins's research has been funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and the National Science Foundation, among others. She has given more than 150 presentations on most around the world, and her publications have appeared in journals in the fields of behavioral science, quantitative methodology, medicine, and engineering. Dr. Collins has held tenured faculty positions at the University of Southern California and at Penn State University, where she was Distinguished Professor of Human Development and Family Studies and Director of the Methodology Center. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, the Society of Behavioral Medicine, and is the past president of the Society of Multivariate Experimental Psychology and the Society for Prevention Research. On a personal note, I took Dr. Collins's workshop a few years ago, and it was so good, I wrote a specific aims page during that workshop, which has now led to several major grants for myself. And so I couldn't have been more excited listening to her and just being inspired by this research design. It really just opened up a whole universe of new research questions for myself. And I think just speaking in the palliative care space really inserts a research approach that helps us address some of the most pressing questions in our space. So with that, Dr. Collins, welcome.
Thank you, Nick, for that very nice introduction. Let me just get situated here. Oops. Okay, can you see that?
Looks great.
All right, wonderful. Okay, I was asked to talk about current and future directions in MOST, which is really fun for me because usually I have the job of introducing MOST along with talking about whatever I want to talk about. So thank you for the opportunity to have some time to talk about the really exciting stuff that I and others are doing. Here's an overview of my talk today. I'm going to give you just a very brief history of MOST. And then I'll talk about two of many areas that are especially active research areas right now. One of them is decision making. And the other one is the whole idea of how MOST can contribute to the field of implementation science and who the stakeholders are and how they can contribute. And then I want to talk about intervention optimization in the year 2030. I kind of have my eye on 2030 for reasons I'll explain later. So a very brief history of MOST. The first publication in MOST was Collins, Murphy, Nair, and Strecker in 2005. That was a result of a hallway conversation that Susan Murphy, who is at Harvard now but was at Michigan at the time, had with her department head. Susan's, most of you probably know, she's a statistician, and Vijay Nair was her department head, and he's a well-known engineering statistician. And Susan and I have collaborated for many years, and she'd been listening to me crab about what I saw as the state of intervention science. And she happened to be talking with Vijay about this, and Vijay said, well, how do you guys develop interventions? And she explained it to him, and he said, well, that's not the way an engineer would develop a product. And they started talking about what we could do. And Susan immediately got on the phone to me and said, you have to come to Michigan. You and I are going to spend 2 days brainstorming with Vijay about this. And we did. And I just learned so much. And the result was this publication, which was the first. And now, of course, there have been many publications in this area. The first grant that I know of was funded in 2009. It was a P50. And I am so grateful to Mike Fiore and Tim Baker at Wisconsin, because they were the first people who were willing to take these ideas out for a spin in a serious way. These ideas were a cornerstone, methodological cornerstone of that P50, and we're still collaborating today. There was a major reframing of MOST in around 2016. The first phases of MOST were screening. The first two phases were screening and refining, and then the last one was confirming. Those came right out of engineering. And I was having trouble getting traction with MOST, and I just sort of started pondering it and realized that those phases didn't really map onto what intervention scientists did. And so we reframed MOST to the current phases, and that I think made a really big difference. And of course, this has already been mentioned, this is maybe more a milestone for me than for anyone else, but 2 books were published in 2018. And to date, I actually haven't done a census of this for a while, but NIH has funded well over 100 projects at this point, including at least 15 K awards that I know of. I'm sure there's others that I don't necessarily know about. And this, of course, you've seen this before, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and then maybe people tuning in for the first time. The 3 phases of MOST are preparation, optimization, and evaluation. And what's really different about MOST is the insertion of the optimization phase before evaluation in an RCT. Okay, now I'll talk about 2 areas that are especially active right now. One of them is decision making. That's right here on this flow chart. That little bullet point there that says identify the intervention that meets the optimization objective. For years, I've been telling people, oh, just use the results of the optimization trial to identify the intervention that meets your optimization objective. But that, of course, is trivializing what is really a very complicated, or can be a very complicated process. The current approach, the decision-making, is described in my book in chapter 7. It's also described in an article in, I think, 2014 or 15 in Translational Behavioral Medicine. It involves sifting through all of the ANOVA effects. You start by selecting components that show an important main effect in the desired direction, and then you reconsider all of this in the light of any important interactions that are detected. And this is, I still think, a good approach for determining which components are active if that's your primary objective, just determining which components are active. But this approach has some important limitations, and in recent years, I think people have been bumping up against these limitations a lot. First of all, there can be a lot of effects to sift through. If it's a 2 to the 5th optimization trial, there would be 31 effects to sift through, and that's a lot of effects. Importantly, this approach does not readily enable use of cost effectiveness in an optimization objective. And very often people are interested in including cost in some way in the optimization objective. And here, when I use the term cost, it should be broadly defined to include time and other resources. And something else that I've been seeing increasingly is that people have more than one outcome. And Dr. Sayer's presentation, I think, was a great example of that, where more than one outcome is clearly important in his work. But if you're using the approach that I outlined in my book, it's really intended for one outcome only. And I guess it would work pretty well if the results were the same across the outcomes, but that doesn't happen very often. So what do you do when results differ across outcomes? And then it's based on classical hypothesis testing. And there's nothing wrong with classical hypothesis testing, but we haven't talked about this today and probably won't have much time to talk about it. But when you're optimizing an intervention, you're working from a decision priority perspective. You're less interested in drawing formal scientific conclusions than you are in deciding which components and component levels are going to go into your intervention. And so a Bayesian approach is really a better fit for this kind of thinking. So I've had the great good fortune to work with these 2 people the past several years. Dave Van Ness is a professor in health policy and administration at Penn State. He's a health economist and also an expert in Bayesian statistics and decision theory. And Jillian Strayhorn is a PhD student in human development and family studies. Dave and I are jointly supervising her dissertation work. And she landed an F31 award. The title is Optimizing Substance Misuse Prevention and Treatment Interventions for Enhanced Public Health Impact, Incorporating Bayesian Decision Analytics into the Multiphase Optimization Strategy. So we've been working, the 3 of us, very hard on developing better approaches for starting with the results of an optimization trial and ending up with selecting the optimized intervention. So I'm going to talk about the work I'm going to be talking about now is really their work. The three of us are doing it, but they're really the ones who are much more knowledgeable. And I should tell you, you may have questions in the question period that I won't be able to answer or won't be able to answer very well, because I'm still learning this stuff too. Anyway, we're working on a new approach, the decision-making in MOST, that incorporates ideas from multi-criteria decision analysis, that enables use of a value function. I'm going to talk about the value function in a moment, that represents decision maker preferences about which outcomes are more important, and opens up the possibility of doing a value efficiency analysis, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. So value functions. This is something that I'm just learning about. Apparently, health economists use value functions all the time, but this was a new idea for me, and I'm still, as I said, I'm still learning about this. It's a way of, when you have multiple outcomes, it's a way of combining the outcomes for decision-making purposes. There's many different value functions. And to be honest, as I said, I'm still learning about them, but there's one that's pretty straightforward, as you might expect, just a simple linear combination of the outcomes. So it could be unweighted, that is to say the outcomes are equally weighted, or it could be weighted depending on the decision maker's preferences about what's more important. When you use this kind of a value function, you're saying that a low value on one outcome can be compensated for by a high value on another one. Now that you may or may not be comfortable with that. You may or may not be comfortable with the idea that the intervention you end up with has, say, zero effect on one of the outcomes, but an extremely strong effect on another one. With this approach, that would basically be equivalent to another outcome where the intervention had a moderate effect on both of them. But I just want to point out that these value functions are a way of expressing what you're looking for in the optimized intervention. But for now, we're working primarily with these linear combinations. I'll come back to that very briefly later. Value efficiency analysis is a tool that's helpful in decision-making in MOST. It's a special case of cost-effectiveness analysis, but we're calling it value efficiency analysis because it's not a thorough cost-effectiveness analysis. Now, I've been talking with intervention scientists for the past several years about cost-effectiveness analysis, and sometimes intervention scientists kind of blanch when you mention cost-effectiveness analysis, because to do a thorough cost-effectiveness analysis, it's a huge job, and it's certainly a very worthwhile thing to do, but it's a big endeavor. You have to get the costs of a lot of different things. You have to estimate a lot of different kind of downstream outcomes. What I'm talking about here is not a thorough cost-effectiveness analysis. Instead, it just involves implementation costs. And the idea here is that when you're preliminarily making a decision about what components and component levels go into the optimized intervention, implementation cost is an important consideration. You don't want to end up, of course, with an intervention that is very costly to implement and doesn't deliver much in the way of an outcome. So you can think of this as a limited or preliminary cost effectiveness analysis, but we do want to distinguish it from kind of what would be a thorough or standard cost effectiveness analysis. So we're calling this value efficiency analysis. So I'm going to present a hypothetical example here. This is the story here is one that I've used a lot in my writing. It's an example that's threaded through my book. So consider an intervention aimed at people who are living with HIV who also drink heavily. And those of you who work in the HIV area know that there's lots of reasons why, if you're HIV positive, you shouldn't drink at all, or if you do, drink very, very moderately. And the objectives here are reducing alcohol use and increasing ART adherence. And for the optimization objective, let's say we're looking for the most cost-effective intervention, where cost effectiveness is going to be defined in terms of implementation costs, not downstream costs. The candidate components are motivational interviewing. Could be no or yes, that is not included or included. Peer mentoring, also levels no and yes. Text messaging, no and yes. Mindfulness meditation, no or yes. And then this last one is a little different. Behavioral skills training could be low intensity or high intensity. So those are the two levels that we're looking at. Suppose you conducted an optimization trial using this 2 to the 5th factorial design. And I would just like to clarify something here. This is a source of widespread confusion, and it really doesn't have to be. So this is a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 factorial experiment. So you can see why we like this exponential notation, because it gets kind of cumbersome after you have more than 3 or so factors. So this is a 2 to the 5th factorial experiment. It's not a 2 by 5. A 2 by 5 factorial experiment would have 2 factors, and one factor would have 2 levels and the other factor would have 5 levels. So I'm not trying to be pedantic here. A 2 by 5 would actually be a different experimental design. So it's just, I think, important to be clear about what we're talking about. So this is a 2 to the 5th factorial design. You can see it has 32 or 2 to the 5 experimental conditions. And the outcome variables we're going to use are alcohol use. And let's just say we're operationalizing that as number of days in a 30-day period with less than 1 drink. So it probably should be called alcohol non-use. But notice that the way I frame this, a higher number is better. And ART adherence, number of days in a 30-day period where ART is taken as directed. So again, a higher number is better in both of these outcomes. This is the experimental design again. With each of these combinations of components, once you fit the regression model to the data, you would get a y-hat. You get a y-hat for each of these outcomes. And you see there's 32 different y-hats. There's one for each of corresponding to each of these experimental conditions. And over on the left, you see that arrow pointing down. I just want to point out to you that I'm going to be on a plot that's coming up very soon. I'm going to be using a symbol to indicate what the combination of components is. So there's a letter corresponding for each combination of components. So each, I should have said before, each experimental condition corresponds to a combination of component levels. So for example, where you see E, that means that only the E factor is turned to high. Where it's CE, that means C and E are turned to high or yes. So that's how we're going to be representing these different experimental conditions or combinations of components on a plot that I'm going to be showing you in a moment. So again, based on this optimization trial, we've conducted this optimization trial. We have data. We fit a regression model. We get these y-hats based on the data, and now we're going to be using those y-hats in decision making. Well, so let's take a moment to look at the top 10 combinations of components for each of the 2 outcomes. Now, life would be very simple if the top 10 combinations were the same, or even if the top 1 was the same. But that's not what happened here. You see that if you just worry about alcohol use and don't think about ART adherence, the top ranked combination is the AB intervention. If you're just concerned about ART adherence and you forget about alcohol use, the top one is ABCD. So, okay, maybe we think, well, the top 10 are going to be the same. They're just shuffled around, but that also isn't what happened. The ones that are highlighted in blue appear in both lists, and there's only 4 of those. So out of the 10 in each list, only 4 of them appear in both lists. So this is just to illustrate the kind of complexity that you can be faced with when you're trying to do this kind of decision making. Now, suppose you have data on cost, and motivational interviewing costs $300 per person. Peer mentoring, these are per person costs. Peer mentoring is $150. Text messaging is $50. Mindfulness meditation is $200. And for behavioral skills training, the low intensity is 25, high intensity is 225. So those are the costs. Now, this is a value efficiency plot. So let's take a moment to look at this. The first time I saw one of these, I really had to stare at it. And unfortunately, you're not going to have the time in this presentation to sit and stare at it at the time that I had that day. So I'm going to try and walk you through it, but it's a little unfamiliar, although there may be health economists in the audience or people who collaborated with health economists who will find this more familiar. The thing to me that is very counterintuitive is that Y hat is on the x-axis, and health economists who work in the cost effectiveness space like to do that. I'm not 100% sure why, but it's the standard there. So cost is on the Y axis. So each dot represents one of the combinations of components. So you can see for A, B, C, D, E, which is way over on the right, you can see that the Y hat associated with that, and we're talking about alcohol only. The Y hat associated with that is about 0.4, but let's not worry about how this is scaled. And then if you look across at cost, it's somewhere between $800 and $1,000 per person. So each of these points can be represented on a plot like this. The idea here is to get a sense of what are the combinations of components that are giving you a good expected outcome, and how costly are they? Okay, so this is a value efficiency plot. This is the plot for alcohol. Now I want to show you the frontier of efficiency. The cost-effective alternatives fall along this frontier of efficiency. And right away you can see that we've eliminated a lot of alternatives, which is extremely helpful. And of course, you don't have to select the most cost-effective analysis. So we're trying most cost-effective alternative. We're trying to do that here. There may be times when you don't want to do that, and we can talk about why you might not want to during the discussion period if you like. But my objective here is really to illustrate what the frontier of efficiency is. The frontier of efficiency is all of the combinations that are not dominated by other combinations. So, for example, why would you select this one when you can have an equally effective intervention and a lower cost, right? So that's what we're trying to get at by identifying the frontier of efficiency. Now let's look at the same plot for ART adherence. You see that the frontier, right away you can see that the frontier of efficiency is different here, which you would expect based on what I showed you before about the top 10 outcomes. And again, why would you select that combination, whatever it is, when you can have a more effective intervention at a lower cost? So the frontier of efficiency is identifying, again, the combinations that are not dominated by other combinations. Okay, we looked just now at these two outcomes separately, but we have the issue of, things are different for these two outcomes. So how are we going to reconcile that? We can combine the outcomes, as I said before, using a value function. The weights express the decision maker's preferences about what is important. The decision maker might think that these two outcomes are equally important, or the decision maker might think that one outcome is more expensive than is more preferable, more important than the other. And this is important, that different preferences can lead to different optimized interventions, and that's okay. That's to be expected, but it makes identifying those preferences really critical. Here is a value efficiency plot for a linear value function that just used equal weights. So alcohol use and ART adherence are weighted 50-50 here. And you can see the frontier of efficiency there. There's 4 items on it. Now, keep that in mind for a moment. This is another value efficiency plot with a different weighting. So for this one, alcohol use is weighted more heavily than ART adherence. And the frontier of efficiency is different now than it was a moment ago. And now let's turn that around and weight them the other way so that alcohol is weighted 30 and ART adherence is weighted 70, which is probably more from a public health perspective what you would want, because you want people to get their viral loads down. That's very important. Again, it's yet a different frontier of efficiency. So I made this table that enables us to compare the different frontiers of efficiency. I probably shouldn't have included the null on this because that just always comes up in the frontier of efficiency. It's kind of a starting point. But you can see that we have these different combinations under consideration. Now, the good news is we don't have 32 combinations under consideration. So we've eliminated a lot of them. So that's great. But we have A only, B only, AB, ABCD, ABCE, and then all of the components. And depending on the decision maker's preferences, any of those might be considered the optimized intervention. As I was speaking just now, I was thinking about Dr. Sayer's talk and wondering, when we get to the discussion, I'd love to hear how he would weight obesity or BMI or weight in pounds. I don't really know what the outcome would be if he was if he goes in the direction that he's talking about, which would be, of course, a multi-objective type of intervention. So of course, the choice of the value function, the choice of the weights matter, as I said before. And of course, different preferences can lead to different optimized interventions, as I just showed you. And it's also the case, to complicate things further, that different decision makers are likely to have different preferences. So something that has to be negotiated if there's more than one decision maker is, can you negotiate a set of weights that everybody's happy with? Okay, so that's what we're doing in decision making. Now I'd like to talk for a few moments about implementation science and stakeholders. So according to NCI, implementation science is the study of methods to promote the adoption and integration of evidence-based practices, interventions, and policies into routine healthcare and public health settings to improve the impact on population health. Such a worthwhile objective. And those of us who identify as intervention scientists, I think, have to ask ourselves how many of the interventions that are developed in academia ever make their way into common practice. Not many. You saw this in a couple of other presentations, the classical treatment package approach, just a kind of schematic drawing of that. And at this point, typically, considerations like affordability, scalability, and efficiency don't enter in anywhere. In fact, if you're an academic intervention scientist, your objective, and I hope this doesn't sound terribly cynical, but your objective is typically not to develop an intervention that's affordable, scalable, and efficient. Your objective typically is to develop an intervention that's going to give you a significant effect in that RCT, because that's how your career is going to be made, getting a significant effect in an RCT. And that, I think, is a big part of the reason why a lot of the interventions that are developed in academia just never see the light of day. Okay, so evaluation of an RCT addresses the question, does the intervention demonstrate a significant effect? And if it does, then you go on to look at issues of implementation. Is the intervention affordable? Is it otherwise scalable? those are important questions. Yeah. But what if the answer is no? What if the answer is no? What if it's effective or efficacious, but not affordable, not scalable? How do you go back and make the intervention affordable and scalable? You really can't, because you don't, if you've used the classical treatment package approach, you don't know which components are and are not contributing to the effect that you saw in the RCT. And in fact, this is a real problem when ad hoc modifications are made to interventions. That's something else that happens. Some interventions do end up being implemented, but these on-the-ground ad hoc modifications are made, which seem quite reasonable at the time, but you just don't know whether a component that's being detuned or removed altogether might have contributed mightily to the effect that was observed in an RCT. So you really can't go back to try and make the intervention more scalable and more efficient or more affordable. You can't go back without risking destroying effectiveness. So I'd like to pose the question, what if we change the order in which we do things? So what if from the very beginning, you considered not only effectiveness, but also affordability, scalability, and efficiency? And what if people who are trying to make their careers were encouraged to do this and rewarded for doing it well? And the ideal here would be what in those of us working in this most area call immediate scalability. So immediate scalability means that the intervention out of the box, so to speak, is scalable without any additional modifications. And by scalable, we mean it can be implemented exactly as it was evaluated with no need for ad hoc modifications. Now, that is aspirational. That probably isn't achieved very often, but I think it's an ideal to shoot for. So this means that we need to start by asking a number of questions that we haven't been asking for until we haven't been asking currently until much later in the process, if at all. So one question is, who is going to pay for implementation of this intervention? Now, let's stop right there. I've been, for the past several years, when I interact with intervention scientists, and a lot of people contact me for advice about how to set up their ideas within MOST. It's always so interesting to talk to them. But I've been kind of closing the conversation lately by asking them, okay, so suppose you develop and optimize this intervention, and it works out great, and it's going to go to scale. Who would you expect to pay for it if it goes to scale? And most of the time, particularly if it's someone from the US, a little different in other countries, but most of the time, if it's somebody from the US, they don't have any idea who would pay for it. They've never thought about that. And sometimes the reality is there probably isn't anyone who would be willing to pay for it, at least not in the form that they're currently developing the intervention. And then of course, the next question is, once you identify those people, how much are they willing to pay? We can also ask, who are the on-the-ground people who will be responsible for implementation? Are these community volunteers? Are they professionals? Are they paraprofessionals? And how much time out of a work week can they devote to implementing this intervention? That also is, I think, something that doesn't get considered enough. And that is the way these ad hoc modifications get started. Some people swoop in and say, okay, we've got this intervention now, you have to deliver it, without really any discussion of, okay, if you're going to spend time doing this, we're not going to expect you to do this other thing. What level of complexity can these implementers handle? And are they in a job where they can stop what they're doing and focus on the intervention? Or is it something, for example, that's being administered in an emergency department where there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on all the time, where the implementers are going to be distracted? Is there an upper limit on the number of components that these implementers can handle? What training will they need? Who's going to provide the training? Who's going to pay for it? And when new people are onboarded because other people have quit, who's going to pay for the additional training? So how do we obtain the answers to questions like these? Well, we have to identify stakeholders. And I made a list here of some general categories of stakeholders, but I think a lot more thought needs to be given to this. So payers, of course, are one stakeholder, and that would be health insurers in the US and government agencies, potentially. In a place like Great Britain, it might just be the National Health. Implementers, who's going to be implementing the intervention, teachers, healthcare providers, community volunteers, emergency room personnel. There could be a lot of different possibilities there, depending on the intervention, and other stakeholders, for example, community leaders. I'm sure those of you who work in a field more than I do, I'm sure can think of a lot of different possibilities here. But once we've identified the stakeholders, we need to talk to them very early in the process. We need to ask stakeholders what constraints are operating. We need to find out who is willing to pay for an intervention that's being developed and how much they're willing to pay. To me, it doesn't make sense to develop an intervention that costs more than anyone is willing to pay. Willingness to pay for staff training. Again, if willingness to pay for staff training isn't there, it makes more sense to develop a simple intervention that doesn't require as much training. How much time out of the workday will the staff be allowed to have, and what other constraints are operating? The answers to these kinds of questions hold the key to immediate scalability. We're not going to be able to develop interventions until we understand these kinds of constraints. There are a number of open questions, so many, but I'm listing a few here. How do we identify stakeholders? I naively thought when I first started working in this area that it would be really easy just to find out. For example, I've done a lot of work in smoking cessation, but we'll just ask health insurers how much they'd be willing to pay for a smoking cessation intervention. But it turns out that even there, it's not necessarily easy to identify who would have the answer to that question. And how do we best, once we've found these stakeholders, how do we best engage them in intervention optimization? These are busy people. Can we even engage them in intervention optimization? Which of the stakeholders should be considered decision makers? The set of stakeholders is going to be larger, or a better way to put that is, the set of decision makers is going to be a subset of the set of stakeholders. To my mind, and maybe this is about the definition of stakeholders versus decision makers, but to me, stakeholders are people who can tell us about what constraints are operating in a given situation, what we should be thinking about to achieve immediate scalability. And once that is defined, the decision makers are the ones who decide what components and component levels are selected within those constraints. And they're not necessarily the same people. So that's just some current thinking about implementation science and stakeholders. There's some other active research areas that are really interesting. We are working on incorporating a more Bayesian perspective, as I had mentioned before, into decision analysis and for selecting the optimized intervention, but not just for selecting the optimized intervention, also, and this came up in the discussion previously at this meeting, how do you decide whether to go on to do the RCT? It seems to me that once you've conducted an optimization trial, there's 3 different possibilities, only one of which is to go on and do an RCT. So you might want to go on and do an RCT, or it could be that the results are so disappointing that it's clear that the optimized intervention is so feeble that you would not want to do an RCT. In that case, it's pretty clear you go back to the preparation phase and work on the conceptual model and prepare for another optimization trial. But what if it's a little more ambiguous and you're wondering, well, the results look pretty good. Maybe the results are so good that we don't need to do an RCT. So making that decision about which of those three directions you need to go, that's an interesting decision, and I think a Bayesian perspective could be brought in there. Value functions. There's the value function called the Cobb-Douglas. It's nonlinear. Don't ask me what it is because I don't understand it yet. But there's a number of other value functions that are familiar to economists that are nonlinear combinations, and we're working on identifying those, and eventually we hope to help intervention scientists to become familiar with them in case they express their preferences better than linear combination of outcomes. Weight elicitation. Weight elicitation is a really interesting area. There's been a lot of attention paid to that in the decision theory area. That's something that needs to be brought in here, I think. I sort of acted like those 50-50, 30-70, 70-30 weights just came out of the sky, but actually it's important to help people to identify what weights should be used. And there is a literature on that, but it's not been applied in intervention. Those ideas have not been applied in intervention optimization to my knowledge. And refining optimization trial designs for adaptive interventions. I'm involved in a P50 with Billy Namshani and Danny Almiral at Michigan and Susan Murphy at Harvard. And we're working on developing some variations on the SMART and the micro-randomized trial for various kinds of adaptive interventions. And then, of course, applications of MOST in lots of different areas. It's so interesting to see what intervention scientists are doing with MOST. I think I want to give, all of you in the audience a little pep talk about MOST. I feel like now is a great time to be proposing optimization trials and using MOST, because 10 years ago, I will admit that the first applications that went through review committees, the reaction by reviewers a lot of times was, this is from outer space. I have no idea what you're talking about. Now, that hardly ever happens. Reviewers at least have a sense of what MOST is, although I think more education of reviewers is needed. And yet, so MOST is still new enough to be considered innovative, but it's familiar enough that it's not, you won't get this, oh my gosh, this is from outer space reaction from reviewers. So I think you can still be the first one to apply MOST in a particular area and wave around the innovation of that. So that's why I think now is a great time to be applying MOST. I feel like in 10 years, either everybody will be using MOST or nobody will be using MOST, and I don't know which way it'll go, but for right now, I think we can capitalize on the innovativeness of it. Okay, intervention optimization in 2030. I'm going to share with you that I have a moonshot goal, and my moonshot goal is to make intervention optimization standard operating procedure by the year 2030. Now, what do I mean by standard operating procedure? That it's generally expected that an intervention will have been optimized prior to the proposal of an RCT. That's what I mean by optimization being standard operating procedure. So I want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you to answer this, but are you in? Are you in to try to make intervention optimization standard by the year 2030? So a number of things are needed if that's going to happen. And one thing that I think is needed is a reevaluation of what kind of research is valuable. Optimization trials are definitely not pilot studies, and they should not be considered merely a lead up to the main event of an RCT. A well-conducted optimization trial contributes so much to intervention science or implementation science, depending on what you're doing. You can, based on an optimization trial, you learn what strategies worked and which ones didn't work. Depending on the design that you've selected, you can look at interactions between components. You can do some really interesting mediation analyses that will show you which, for a component that worked, which mediator or mediators are affected by that particular component. If a component didn't work, you can use mediation analysis to find out why. Is it that the component did not move the mediator, or is it that the component did move the mediator, but the mediator did not move the outcome? Those suggest two different approaches to improving the intervention. So much can be learned from an optimization trial. I really think that as a field, we should agree that optimization trials make important contributions. I'm not saying they replace the RCT, they don't at all. They make valuable and unique contributions to intervention science. And some people making their careers might want to specialize in optimization trials, and they would be making, I think they would have a valuable career by doing that. And in fact, an exciting grant proposal might involve solely optimization trials. In fact, there are good reasons not to propose an RCT and an optimization trial in one grant proposal. I can explain why I say that later if you're interested. Of course, one thing that's needed is reviewers who understand most. There have been well over 100 successful NIH grant proposals using most, as I said before. And lots of journal articles have reported optimization trials. So those have all gotten through review. But still the case that many reviewers are unfamiliar with most, and most is a really different way of thinking. It's a very different way of thinking, and it's counterintuitive for people who have been trained primarily in the RCT and have not been exposed to most. A question I get all the time is, how can we educate reviewers about most? And I will tell you, frankly, I don't know how to do that. And I'm open to ideas about how to increase the pool of reviewers who are familiar with most. I'd be up for any kind of video that you might suggest, or I'm open to suggestions. I think that there's a need for change in the intervention science culture. And here's how you can help. First of all, as I said before, let's stop considering the RCT the inevitable main event of any research, of any intervention research. Instead, let's have a culture where the contribution of the optimization trial, whether it be a factorial experiment, fractional factorial experiment, a SMART, an MRT, or even some of the more engineering-based approaches that people like Eric Heckler and Daniel Rivera are working on, that those make a different and unique kind of contribution that's also important. And those of us who have the ear of people at NIH, it would be great to encourage them to restructure funding to enable a more iterative and discovery-driven approach to intervention science. So let me explain what I mean by that. All of us, when we were trained as scientists, we learned that you conduct a study, and based on the results, you then plan your next study. And this actually is the way to go. I think we all believe that that's a good idea. But now, I guess this is taking me back to what I said a minute ago about suggesting that you don't propose both an optimization trial and an RCT in one grant, because suppose you conduct an optimization trial and then you propose to do a follow-on RCT. You conduct the optimization trial, but it turns out you don't have enough components to make an intervention that you feel you would like to evaluate in an RCT. It actually wouldn't be ethical for you to do the RCT because there you don't have equipoise, I would say. So that's a real problem. It would be much better, I think, if we had some kind of a way of writing the grant proposal so that you could first propose an optimization trial and then write a branching into it that says, okay, I'm going to evaluate the results as follows. And depending on what the results are, I'll either go ahead to the RCT or I'll conduct another optimization trial. It could be the same budget because I think the expenses for that would be roughly the same. So that's what I mean by a more iterative and discovery-driven approach to intervention science. And I think we would move intervention science forward faster that way. More training is needed in most and more resources for people who are interested in learning about most. Launching very soon is going to be an introductory course on the COERE platform that Kate Guastavero and I developed. And anyone who wants to can take the course for free. COERE will charge you $50 if you want a special completion certificate, but you may want that certificate and that's fine, but you can get all the knowledge that's in there for free. And you can watch for this, and we have a number of other courses planned. We're planning a more technical introduction for quant types. We're planning on a course on analysis of data from a factorial optimization trial, and a course on decision-making based on the results of the factorial optimization trial after we've completed some of the work that I showed you, gave you a glimpse of earlier in this presentation. So here's a way you can help if you want to. Consider offering a course on intervention optimization in your graduate program. Well, I guess that's easy for me to say that you should go out and offer a course on intervention optimization, but we've set up the COERE course, all the slides are there, so you can download any materials from the COERE course you want. And again, you don't need to pay the $50 for the certificate to do that. And you could even, if you don't want to use those slides, you could even use the COERE course itself in a flipped classroom approach. So in other words, you could develop some practical hands-on exercises, and that's what you could do in the classroom, and your students could watch the COERE course. So anyway, if you think you might want to do that, of course, you should take a look at the COERE course, but I invite you to use the COERE course in any way you want, and that goes for any other COERE courses that we develop in the coming years. I am in the process of setting up the Intervention Optimization Initiative at NYU. There is a website, a couple of people have mentioned this, and there's a number of resources on this website. The URL is there, and my email address is there. I'm always happy to hear from people who are interested in most, and my Twitter handle is there. So it's been really great having a chance to present these ideas to you. And it's also really great for me to see that so many people are interested in most and interested in applying these ideas in their work. And so this concludes my presentation, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Wow, Dr. Collins, thank you so much for an incredible talk full of bold ideas. Really just got my wheels turning about all these different elements of most and the factorial trial design and the decision-making around components, how we do that. I'd love to invite the audience to ask questions now. Again, please post your questions in chat. We'll ask you to unmute and introduce yourself if you do. And Dr. Sayre, if I could ask you to unmute, you also chimed in about the issue of weighting, sort of what's most important in the outcomes, particularly when there's more than one outcome. And there may be sort of qualitatively more than one different type of outcome. It might be cost and effectiveness and scalability. Dr. Sayre, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I thought the weighting issue was actually a pretty funny one, right? Because we're talking about weight and weighting, both in a literal sense and in a literal sense. But I think this brings up an interesting point to me that I think gets at, again, this isn't exactly addressing your question, Dr. Collins, but it's what is our motivation as researchers and clinicians for inducing weight loss in folks? And what is a patient or participant's motivation for engaging in weight loss? And what are our differences in expectations, right? So I just like an example that I use a lot, right? So like a woman walked into my study, she's 5'5", 200 pounds. She has a BMI around 33, right? So for us, from a clinical perspective, if she were to achieve 10% weight loss and keep it off, she'd be like a glowing success. So she's lost 20 pounds and kept it off. Do you think that's what she wants? Not at all, right? She doesn't want 20 pounds. She doesn't want to be 180 pounds. She comes in thinking she wants to be 130. And so there's this, that's a whole nother area where we have this issue of weighting that's kind of different. So that's, I think, partly to get to some of these ideas about like what's really most important in improving health and well-being of folks with obesity. It's really reframing around why are we even trying to induce weight loss in the first place? For me, I just want you to be healthier. I don't care what you look like.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've done a tiny bit of work in weight loss, the opt-in study with Bonnie Spring and others. And weight is an interesting outcome because it's one of the few where you can go too far, right? I mean, with alcohol use as an outcome, well, if you get to zero, great. With viral load, if you get to zero, great. But with weight loss, and of course, it's possible for people to lose too much weight. So yeah, weight loss is a really interesting outcome for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I mean, I think this when you start thinking about optimizing interventions, you have to think about optimizing for what exactly. And when you have more than one outcome, it forces. I think it should force us to think about what of these array of outcomes, what is most important. And what we've traditionally done in the classical treatment package approach, I think, is if you have more than one outcome, you just look at each of them separately and you say, okay, well, it worked on this one, it worked on this one, it didn't work on this one. But we're doing something different here. We're actually engineering the intervention. And so if you're engineering the intervention to have a certain type of outcome, that forces you to decide which of those is more important. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying about health rather than weight per se. I think I feel like that's really important. But it doesn't answer the question of, I mean, you Dr. Sayer, still have multiple outcomes, and it doesn't really answer the question of how, I mean, you, like any other intervention scientist, you just have to think about, that. It's not easy.
So one follow-up question for me on that is it wrong to say that the result of a factorial trial are multiple products, multiple versions of an intervention, and here, take your pick. Here's the one that costs the least, but has some minimally beneficial effect. Oh, here's the Cadillac model that if you can afford it, it has a maximum effect, and everything in between. Is it possible to have multiple versions of an intervention result from an optimization trial that in different contexts may be equally reasonable?
Yes, I completely agree with that. And in fact, when I talk more to implementation scientists, I try to make the point that different settings, they have different constraints, and you can use the results of the same optimization trial. Now, this is assuming that the results can reasonably generalize across these different settings, and of course, you'd have to make that same same assumption for an RCT also. But if you can assume that the results can reasonably generalize, then you can actually develop different optimized interventions for different settings. To take a simple example, suppose one setting can afford $500 a person, and another setting can only afford $300 a person. Well, those would call for potentially, two different interventions. And another point I want to make that I think is important is that the set of components that would go into the optimized intervention for the $300 setting is not necessarily a subset of what goes into the $500 setting. So it's not like you can optimize for the Cadillac version and then just take out components. That's not the way to get the best outcome for the money that you have. But yeah, there's not one optimized intervention, because it is going to vary depending on what the objectives are.
Dr. Mercavero.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just such a brilliant and provocative lecture. And so I've got a lot of ideas in my head, and I don't know if it's going to come out right because it's trying to process and think all at once. But for the last few years, I've been involved with some implementation science work with a group in HIV, and I'm not an implementation scientist, but I've been exposed to that space. And your comments, I've been thinking a lot about how does that IS work marry with not just the RTs, CTs, and optimization. The idea of generalizability and transportability you just brought up too made me think about other behavioral economic techniques about patient preference. So even if you know the cost, and you could look at your frontier outside of the context of the trial and the sample, is that reflective of at a population level? Would someone prefer, and at what level, motivation doing versus a peer mentor versus those components? So just again, I don't have a well-formulated question, but just to think about the idea of, if the ultimate goal is not to do the trial and publish it, but to actually deploy it to reach people's health and wellness and prevention and impact, just trying to bring in some experimentation with the optimization and trial. So it's not sequential. Like you said, it's not just we do this step and this step and this step, and 17 years later, 1 in 100 things makes it into practice.
Right.
I don't know if I have a question, but again, a lot of thinking and conversations brought it up. I know Larry Harold and I, but just thinking about how can we tie together, I put in the IS framework that J.D. Smith and colleagues, this implementation research logic model. The bottom box is just your intervention, this assumption of evidence-based intervention, and you surround it with the context and the mediators. And so again, I'm sorry, not well formulated, but so provocative in thinking about the intersection. How do we make these worlds meet practically?
Well, I'm really glad to hear what you just said, because I detect a little bit of torment there, and I go through that torment every time I start thinking about implementation science too. I'm not an implementation scientist either, but I'm sort of being drawn into that field for a couple of reasons. One is my colleague Donna Shelley at NYU is starting up a center on implementation science, and so hanging around with her, I'm getting more exposed to it. But also that there are some kind of obvious potential applications of most in this space. But I start churning like you just did, if you don't mind me saying, when I start thinking about this, and for a long time, I resisted the idea that most could be used in the implementation science space. And the reason I resisted that idea is that I think that most calls for kind of inverting the thinking the way I described it. So not taking the classical treatment package approach and then saying, oh, gee, what about implementation? I feel really strongly that to be successful in implementation, you have to be thinking about implementation from the very beginning. About patient preference, that is so interesting. That's a really interesting topic for a variety of reasons. When you want to bring patient preference in, that of course has an impact on the way you would design the optimization trial too. So that could be actually a whole other presentation on that, or at least a very long discussion. That's very interesting topic. So I don't feel like I answered any of your questions. I'll just say I feel your pain, because I have the same thing.
I think I did churn and didn't ask a question, but thank you for sharing.
Terry O'Hara makes a comment that I think relates to this line of thinking about the intersection of most with implementation science, which is this idea of engagement as another factor. And I think about this a lot, because in palliative care, well, folks die and they're really busy. And so we often just spend a lot of resources trying to keep them engaged and in the trial. So Terry, I don't know if I can get you to unmute and ask your question, or if you had other thoughts on your comment.
Yes, I don't have a question. I just thought it was a really good point that we should also be thinking about patient preference, whatever we want to call them, patient preferences, engagement strategies, acceptability, all of those other implementation indicators in our decision making too. Because again, you know, we can get an intervention implemented, but if people aren't going to start or finish, then it's probably not going to have the impact that we wanted to have as well. So just a comment for more discussion.
For me, this raises the question, Dr. Collins, of how does one measure scalability? If it's going to be part of our optimization, now called objective, as well as efficiency. So how do these things of efficiency and scalability or engagement, have you thought about how we measure those objectively and then account for them in the decision-making process?
Yeah. So first of all, feel free to use the term optimization criterion if you want to. The reason we changed it is I noticed when I was doing workshops that a lot of people found the term criterion scary. They thought it sounded very technical, even though it isn't really. So we started referring to it as an objective, and people seem to find that more accessible. So that's the only reason for calling it objective rather than criterion. So how do we measure scalability? Well, to me, my personal definition of scalability is that a completely scalable intervention is an intervention that can be implemented exactly the way it was evaluated, without any on-the-ground ad hoc modifications of any kind. So I guess maybe some people would just call that fidelity. I'm not sure, but I think that could be operationalized, but I don't know, exactly how, because it would vary a lot from application to application. Efficiency to me is not having any inactive components. So an efficient intervention is one where all of the components are pulling in the right direction and there's no dead weight in there, which, by the way, I have to say, if I could only have one thing, it would be that. it would be just eliminating inactive components from our interventions, because I said before in the middle of my talk that most intervention scientists are not thinking about affordability, scalability, or efficiency when they develop interventions. But I would actually go a little farther and say that if what is going to make your career is a significant effect in an RCT, and you don't have to worry about affordability or scalability, then what is going to stop you from adding lots and lots of components to the intervention? Nothing. You'd be foolish not to, actually. So I think a big problem is that a lot of the interventions that are developed in academic settings contain lots of inactive components. There's no penalty, so to speak, for inactive components. There's no disincentive, is a better way to put it. There's no disincentive for including inactive components. As long as you're pretty sure it's not going to be in the minus column, you might as well include it, because it might help you get that significant effect that you're looking for.
Yeah. Dr. Puga had asked a question actually in the last presentation, but I think it relates here to this point of component inclusion. He asked, have you ever gotten pushback from reviewers for removing an intervention component that is considered, quote, essential in a field? And Dr. Puga, I don't know if you want to add to that question, if you're able to.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, I was just kind of wondering if there were ever situations where you're kind of testing which components to include in an intervention that might be well used in a particular field. I'm thinking about in my own field, looking at dementia caregiving interventions and going through this trial, there might be some components that you might find that you need to remove based on the feedback that you get. And that could potentially result in maybe altering an intervention that's been kind of the gold standard, quote unquote. And I'm wondering how that, if you've ever come across a situation when you're proposing your work, that reviewers might push back a little bit that these type of intervention components have been removed.
Yeah, so first of all, let me say I've gotten pushback for just about everything you can think of. So yes, I've gotten pushback for that. I'll share with you something that happened to me a couple of years ago that was very educational, because now I'm going to tell you the story. You're going to think, wow, she's really naive. But I had honestly never thought that this could happen. So I was working with a group of people on an intervention to be developed in an education setting. And we looked at a number of different intervention components, and out of 5 that we tested, 2 of them were effective. And so we wanted to develop this intervention with these two components, and then maybe eventually start looking at some others. Well, the educational institutions said, but you have to include those other components. And I said, I wasn't the one talking to the institution. They don't usually let me talk to the institution people in these collaborations. So I talked to my collaborator and said, but we did this whole thing so that we could eliminate inactive components. And he said, well, the parents need to know that there's components that cover these certain bases. And it sort of doesn't matter. I mean, they would prefer to have effective ones rather than ineffective ones, but ineffective ones work too, from their perspective. You see what I mean? So it was more a cover your butt thing to include the components rather. I mean, I was all about making a really efficient intervention, but I realized that made me realize that there are sometimes other reasons to include intervention components that don't have anything to do with whether they're effective or not. And that was, to be honest, a little disillusioning for me, but at least I know that happens and I can be realistic. So yeah,
Linda, I remember that conversation and you were like, but the science.
Yeah, I know. I know. The idealist versus the realist, yeah.
I wanted to read a comment that Dr. Harold had put in the chat. Another place where most would apply well to implementation science is the design and selection of implementation strategies that are used to get evidence-based interventions into practice. So many strategies to choose from and can be combined in different ways, many parallels to intervention development. Dr. Harold, I don't know if you wanted to add to that comment, but just wanted to hear Dr. Collins's thoughts there. Go ahead.
Sure, I can elaborate. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I said it like I know what the heck I'm talking about when it comes to these designs, but it does strike me that there are some parallels when you're trying to develop an intervention. You have these multiple components and you're trying to sort of define sort of the optimal package. And I think implementation scientists are often struggling with the same thing when it comes to these implementation strategies, recognizing that there's oftentimes no single strategy that's going to be most effective. It's oftentimes bundles of strategies. And as we've been talking about, those strategies may work differently in different contexts. So I think there are a lot of the same kinds of struggles, downstream, if you want to think of it one way. Once the intervention is defined as effective, how do we best get it into practice? And there's a lot of, again, similarities, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a great idea. I mean, I would love to see most used in that context. The unit of analysis, the unit of random assignment and the unit of analysis would probably be at a higher level. It would be, could be a physician with patients nested within the physician, could be a practice, could be a hospital, could be a school. Yeah, there's all kinds of possibilities there. But yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I completely agree.
I wanted to come back to this idea of a stakeholder involvement. And I know that this seems like an area that's still getting itself worked out. I have a current R01 and I have a co-investigator who I've charged with coming up with a stakeholder engagement plan.
Oh, great.
Specifically with what their role is going to be in hopefully 5 years when we have this beautiful data of how we're going to structure their conversations about selecting components
Well, so who are the stakeholders in your work then?
Well, we have discussed it, including patients and caregivers. It also including payer representatives. It also include hospital administrators and clinicians, perhaps together, perhaps in separate groups. We've even discussed using a nominal group technique to see if there are ways we can have people sort of prioritize what for them is sort of the most important outcome. So if this can just be figured out in maybe the next 2 years, that would be great.
Yeah.
Any additional thoughts?
No, I think it takes doing what you're doing, and I'll be really interested to I'd love to hear about what you come up with there. I think that's a whole area of study, is how to bring stakeholders in. So let me ask you, Nick. So who would you expect to actually be in on the decision then? So you've got those people sharing what is important to them and what the constraints are. So then so now you've conducted you got all that from them, you conducted the optimization trial. Who would be in the room when you're selecting the optimized intervention?
Yeah, so like you, I think, why are we developing anything if it's never going to be paid for and actually put into real world practice? And so for me, the payer perspective must be in the room. The healthcare administrator or the service line executive needs to be in that room to talk about how this would actually work or look in real life, because we can't really go any further until we've heard their perspective, because it won't matter what patients and caregivers want if we're not able to get it into the system to actually make it work. So I'm not sure what the best way to incorporate the perspectives is. I do have a feeling that having them in the room is almost necessary.
But you could mean, I just want to ask you one more thing. So you could have, when you say have them in the room, I wonder if you're sort of talking literally or figuratively. So you could have you could sort of have their ideas in the room by having spoken to them and knowing what their weights are and all that. But would you? I'm just wondering, would you literally have them in the room? Would you show them the value, like the value efficiency plots that I showed you guys? Would you show them that and say, okay, here's the frontier of efficiency. Now you tell me, which of these do you like?
Yeah, I mean, that is so interesting. I mean, I think that, that was also the first time of myself looking at a plot like that. And as you explained it, it did make sense. And then I was thinking to myself, I wonder how it would go if I was trying to explain this to folks who rarely even ever look at graphs and charts and see if I can get a reaction. So some of the thoughts that are going in my head were data visualization strategies to get useful and constructive both conversation and reaction to a way of everyone talking about the findings. And I think I still haven't really thought it all the way through yet. And it may be that the first several stakeholder meetings will be about how would you all like to see the data? And of course, this will be a bi-directional conversation, because we'll have ideas that maybe they never heard of, like the value plot you were showing. But other things that they might want to see in different ways. So yeah, in the room, I guess it's always going to be a virtual room these days. And then the conversation is, if you have a payer and a hospital administrator and they have competing interests, fundamentally, how is that going to work? So I don't know the answers.
Yeah. I mean, it's all really interesting. I just feel like this decision-making stuff is so important for most to kind of get to the next level. So I'm really glad to hear that you're including stakeholders. I'll be really interested to hear how that works out.
And I agree, involving them from step one, the preparation phase, is probably, well, not probably, I think that's right, to really engage those individuals early on, addressing not only would be helpful to you, but also what would you actually do in real life? Like, what would you actually pay for? What would you actually do in your practice? I know you don't want one more thing. to see in your 10-minute clinic visit.
Mhm.
So what would work?
Yeah, yeah.
Anne Marie Moretus makes a comment in the chat. I love this design. I love that this design forces the researcher to focus from a critical viewpoint of what isn't working. Non-responders or preferred language, as discussed, those who need, quote, booster or alternative paths. Agree with Dr. Dion Odom with incorporating participatory design principles. Anne-Marie, did you want to add any more to your comment or ask a question?
Nope. I
No.
am a novice, and each time I learn so much. So thank you all for sharing.
Now, Anne-Marie, I encourage you to take a look at the Coursera course when it's up if you're interested in learning more.
I love that idea. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add on to that that I attended Dr. Collins's workshop in the days when she was at Penn, and it was probably the best workshop that I've ever been to.
Oh gosh, thank you. That's a very nice compliment.
I produced a specific Ames page that I immediately submitted for a grant about 3 months later that was funded on the first time, and that did eventually lead to an R1. So that workshop for me was fantastic, and really excited about all the resources that are being developed for Coursera, and the website that was at Penn, I imagine, is being built up at NYU.
Yeah.
The Methodology Center had excellent resources on everything from how to write this for statisticians, how to word your specific aims, here's words to not use on your aims page. Just extraordinarily helpful information to write this type of science. So I see that we're edging towards the end of time. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Collins. Thank you so much for taking, spending a day with us and giving us all of this lecture and all of these big, enormous ideas to think about as we think about the next 10, 20 years of behavioral science. For me, it's really exciting. And it opens to a universe of so many possibilities. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Magavero for closing remarks.
Great. Yeah, no, just thanks. Just briefly, I mean, this was an incredible symposium. So really want to thank our 4 speakers for just such wonderful talks and giving us so much to think about. Rachel and Nick, I mean, just tremendous job preparing, implementing. So kudos and thank you to you, Aaliyah and Jerry. And really everyone that's been here. It's been such an engaged group all morning. Amazing. The comments in the chat, the comments in person. I hope this is not the end. So I think there's a lot of provocative things in your talk, Dr. Collins. I hope we can have these conversations. A lot of folks, I think here, certainly at UAB within the COERE, also in this broader Zoom room, really would love to keep thinking about the intersection of MOST with patient preference and stakeholder engagement and implementation science. So welcome future opportunities, and can't thank you all enough. And in terms of honoring Meredith Kilgore, he was a health economist, just couldn't a better lecture to honor Meredith and his many contributions. So with that, we'll say thank you to everyone. Have a great afternoon. If you're in Birmingham, be safe. Bad weather's rolling in, so be careful. Watch the weather. And everyone else have a great afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It was great meeting all of you.